can test it out. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to day 3, or kind of day 4. I hope you've all had a good day. Probably thinking a lot about what actions we all want to take to end what is abundantly apparent of these long histories of state violence. So I'm going to get right into the things that are heavy. But we're glad you're all here with us tonight. My name is Jamie Wilson. I'm a member of the organizing committee, and I live currently in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is otherwise known as, this is Pueblo territory that I'm on. This is my 5th year. I've been on the committee a bit more, but my 5th year would be walking the trail. And as you know, I wanted, before I introduce our speaker, give you a few updates. One of them is that on the organizing committee, we really want to facilitate as much as possible the building of community here. And so we're really excited to see you all posting to the Facebook page or on Instagram, the comments that are coming on YouTube, and thank those of you that have also been filling out that reflection form. There's a link in your daily email for that. So we want to continue to encourage you all to communicate and share as much as you feel comfortable doing. And I have to also remember this is being interpreted into Spanish, so I'm going to try to slow down. And with all that said, I really want to introduce our speaker tonight, Todd Miller. It is such an honor for me to introduce Todd. I met Todd many years ago when I lived in Tucson, but I really had the pleasure of getting to know Todd on my first Migrant Trail. And Todd also was active in planning the very first Migrant Trail and has walked many times. Todd has been researching and writing about border issues for more than 15 years, currently lives in Tucson. He has also spent many years living and working in Oaxaca, Mexico, I believe working for Witness for Peace. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, Todd. Yeah. And Todd is an absolutely prolific writer. His work has appeared in the New York Times, TomDispatch, The Nation, the San Francisco Chronicle, in these times, Guernica, Al Jazeera, among other places. He's also, some of you may follow this, he's a contributing editor on the border and immigration issue for the NACLA Report on the Americas, and has this column, Border Wars column that he writes. And additionally, since 2014, Todd has been very busy, not only having 2 children, but he has authored 4 books. The first of which was Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security. His third, Empire of Borders, the expansion of the US border around the world, and his forthcoming book to come out in 2021, it looks like, per COVID, is Build Bridges, Not Walls. Which draws on his 20 years of activism and reporting, calling us all to imagine a world without borders. So tonight, we welcome you, Todd. Todd is going to be speaking with us about the global expansion of the US border. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Todd Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your introduction. And it's so great to see all these faces, these familiar faces. It makes me really happy. I feel like this is a success just to be on here and see like all these great people that I've known for so many years. And of course I'm speaking on, day 3 or it's day 3. It's the night before the Thursday. The Thursday is that 16-mile walk from the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge to 3 Points. It's probably around that time where I've done the walk, I think four times the entire walk, and it's around this time when I cease to lose the importance of myself, and I become a part of the bigger whole, right? Like I just, you become, even though you have so much and water and food, it's still I become damaged goods, but right around that point, it begins to be like I'm no longer walking for myself. I'm walking for this common goal of a much bigger purpose, and that's one of the really powerful things for me. I'm always doing the walk, and I haven't been able to do it in the last few years because of children who might pop up behind me. If they do, please forgive me. They have, they have in other occasions. So I do expect it to happen, but maybe it won't. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here, and even though I've only done the trail walk four times, I think about it every year for 17 years. I think every single day. In fact, like this week, I've been trying to do walks and bike. I've tried to bike, really, try to do approximately the miles we do every week, and I actually do that every year even when I can't do it. And it really helps me connect in that way, because I really feel like, a lot of the organizing committee, in a lot of ways is family to me. And so that's why it's, seeing you all is really heartening. So thank you for that. But today I'm gonna talk about some of my research I've done on looking at the expansion of the U.S. border abroad, and so I've also when we get to question and answer, we can talk about many different things, but I'm going to focus on that. And apologies for anyone who's heard me talk about this before, but that's what I'll probably spend about 30 minutes or 40 minutes, 35 minutes talking about this, and then we can go into Q&A, right, Jamie? That's correct. Okay. Anyhow, so let me think. So in September of 2019, right before all this pandemic, at a time when it wasn't even registering that this would be happening, the Empire of Borders, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world, the book got published, and I started doing presentations on that book. And then this year, when the pandemic had actually canceled every single presentation I was going to do, which is basically the reality of everyone on planet Earth, I suppose. But I'll just talk on that, and I'll try to bring in threads of other work while I do that. But one of the things with Empire of Borders was kind of conceptualizing the border in a different way. And I'll put it this way: when I went into the research of this, and one of the things that I tried to do as I was doing these presentations was trying to figure out, when did I start researching this book? And I could say, well, I really started researching in 2016, 2015, but really I realized, well, it was before that. And it was I remember in 2010, I was asked to write a story on the earthquake in Haiti, and an immigration story, to see if people were leaving the island after the earthquake. And I imagine people remember the earthquake in Haiti. It was devastating. There were over 200,000 people who died, and over 1 million people displaced. And when I began to write the story, what I found was not an immigration story. People were really just trying to get their lives back together. People were literally in the rubble of their own homes. It was a border story. the United States sent a jumbo jet over the island, over Haiti, and said, with a pre-recorded voice of the ambassador, who said, if you leave the island, you will be interdicted and returned. And this is a message from the United States. And the United States had sent 16 Coast Guard cutters right up to the shoreline of Haiti. And they had also instructed Geo Group, the private prison company, to open up beds in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for this anticipated exodus. And what happened was not an exodus, as I just said, but the border. For me, what I learned in that moment was how quickly a border can be formed, how far could it extend, 1,000 miles from the mainland of the United States, how aggressive it could be, and how it was much more than just the U.S.-Mexico border, the U.S.-Mexico border being a huge part of it, of course. And I do believe that writing that story was probably, for myself, the first seed to writing Empire of Borders. And it was conceptualizing the border in a kind of more bigger global sense, but as the United States as a protagonist to this border extension. And another story was I went to Puerto Rico in 2012. I actually went there just a month, just right before the pandemic in February, and I can say the same thing. I went to the West Coast, and in 2012, I was very surprised by the amount of green striped vehicles, the kind of vehicles that you see walking the Migrant Trail, right, around Sasa Bay along highway, the different highways, 286 and 86, as, the same exact green stripe vehicles were patrolling the West Coast of Puerto Rico. And I could talk about that. But the story I want to share was one that I interviewed a national park ranger, and he had been deputized by the U.S. Border Patrol, and he was on the Mona Island. And the Mona Island's about 32 miles away from the Dominican Republic, and it's actually a U.S. territory. So he was deputized, so if anyone arrived there without documents to be in the United States of America, they could detain them. And that's, in the story he told me, happened like a month before. And a ship or a boat of people from Haiti, again, it started to sink there, and it crashed, and people got off the boat and ran onto the Mona Island. And of course, they didn't have documents to be in the United States, and they were detained. And then Border Patrol came from Aguadilla in Puerto Rico and brought them back, detained them there, and then formally deported them back to Haiti. And again, that's about 1,000 miles away from the mainland United States. It was just a small little U.S. territory. It's not on the island of Puerto Rico. It's a separate island closer to the Dominican Republic. And yet here's a fragment of the U.S. border. So there's another clue to how big and expansive this border is. And the third story I wanted to share happened in southern Mexico. And this was in 2014. I went there after the Mexico announced their southern border program. And people probably remember in the summer of 2014, there was a lot of attention on the U.S. southern border about unaccompanied children. And the media came down and we're doing a lot of coverage. And during that time, Mexico announced the southern border program. So I went down there and just like 2 or 3 weeks after, and I went to a town called Arriaga, which is about 150 miles south or 150 miles away from Tapachula and the Guatemalan border. And what happened in Arriaga was that it pretty much cleared out of people. And there was people would congregate there, mainly from Salvador, from Guatemala and Honduras, would congregate there because that was where the train left. And they would congregate in the middle of town. But then with the new southern border program, all these operations happened and people just cleared out. And these operations happened with support from the United States, with pressure from the United States, with money from the United States, with resources from the United States, with trainings from the United States. And so And so while I was there, I'd been there the year before, and I'd seen like all the people in the center of town. So I asked, where did everyone go? And people pointed down the rails. So I ended up walking down the rails for a couple miles. It was like the Migrant Trail walking away. You just keep walking and walking. It was very hot in kind of a humid hot in the jungle area of Chiapas. And then finally I got out really far out there, and I started groups of people I started seeing groups of people, and they were camped along the side of the rails. And then I eventually started talking to, I talked to one group for a while, and they were about 10 people, about half of them teenagers, all from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and they were headed to the United States. And there was one man in particular. He was a butcher from Chimaltenango in Guatemala, and he said it was his fourth time trying, and he had the bad luck of crossing or trying to cross in July, exactly when Peña Nieto, the Mexican president, announced the Southern Border Program, and that bad luck led to him being deported 3 times. And so this was his 4th time, and mind you, there's another thing that this reminded me of before I finished the story with him. It reminded me of, what you see in the Arizona desert too, like with the prevention through deterrence strategy, the blockading of the urban areas along the U.S.-Mexico border, how people end up funneling into the desert, going into the desert. And it was very similar to that, because it would just happen. It was really fresh, but people were definitely really forced into these areas that were way more vulnerable. And the terrain itself is very vulnerable, as many people here know. And it just reminded me of not only an extension of the U.S. border, but an extension of the U.S. strategy of prevention through deterrence. And that I got that so strongly when I was talking to this man from Guatemala, and he actually, while we were talking, after he told me he had been deported 3 times, he reached into his pocket and brought out his wallet, and then he opened up his wallet and he showed me that he had no money left, because all his money was gone. And then he said he's trying to get to Miami to see his children, and that's what he wanted to do, was go to see his children. And then he brought out a picture from his wallet of one of his children, this picture was one of those pictures, and it's one of those pictures that you look at and you know that it's been looked at 100, maybe 1,000 times, right? It's a picture that's old. It just looks that it has looks on it, and it's warped at the edges. It's kind of frayed at the edges. But it was a picture of his son, who was 10 years old at the time, and he hadn't seen his son in 8 years. So then he said, I'm gonna make it to Miami no matter what, right? And this is the reason why. And then I thought, I left him my number, and I never ended up hearing from him or anything. But I've wondered about, what happened if he made it. He had such a long journey to go. Like, for me to go to Miami, all I had to do was cruise up to Tuxtla Gutierrez and get on an airplane, and maybe in 5 hours I'm in Miami. For him, who knows how long it was going to take him. He was in the middle of what the U.S., if you look at the U.S. border strategy, it says we have a multi-layered strategy, a quote unquote multi-layered. And he was in the middle of a layer, he got past the layer of the Mexico, Central America, Guatemalan border, which after the 4th attempt, right? But he still had so long to go, and he had to go through. They knew that there was checkpoints up the way, and then he hadn't even arrived to the U.S. southern border yet. And so, that was one of the stories that really propelled me to write, to go into this book. And this idea that this was, the U.S. border is extending is not any sort of secret. It's not something that I had to do a Freedom of Information Act or request for, or anything like that. Like 2 years before I was there in 2014, and I'm meeting this man from Guatemala, Alan Burson, who was a former CBP official. He said that, let me see if I got that quote, exact quote. He said, the Guatemalan border with Chiapas is now our southern border. That's the quote from Alan Burson, and really referring to all the different programs that the United States has been with Mexico, particularly what's known as a Merida Initiative, which has funneled billions of dollars into Mexico. And the third pillar of the Merida Initiative is called creating a 21st century border. And so there you have it. That's through that program, you get a lot going into this Mexico southern border. And then Alan Burson also said, and he's one of the architects of this internationalization of the U.S. border. He said that it's what he called in the post 9/11 era, the externalization or the extension of the U.S. border was what he called a massive paradigm change. So it's an addition. It becomes another part of the U.S. border strategy. And even as I went into researching this book after all these, what I just told you, what I shared with you of these different stories, and knowing that it was pretty extensive, I have to tell you, I didn't know a fraction of what I was going to learn or the extent of it, in terms of like there's 23 Customs and Border Protection attaches around the world. There's 48 Immigration and Customs Enforcement attaches around the world. The United States is doing border programs in more than 100 countries around the world. So literally, you could close your eyes, stand in front of a map, point, and most likely you point at a country that either has a U.S. border program going on right now, or has had a U.S. border program in the past. This is the extensiveness of it was quite startling. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to share a couple quotes from some of our friends at Customs and Border Protection. For example, Robert Bonner, he's a CBP commissioner from 2004. So the first CBP was created in 2003, of course, and he was the first commissioner. He said, extending our zone of security where we can do so beyond our physical borders, so that American borders are the last line of defense, not the first line of defense. So this idea of line of defense, those are his words, militarization of the border, right? Not the last, but not the first, but the last line of defense. So how much is this border extending? And also just to show you that this is not, this continues under the Trump administration. John Kelly, which people remember was the first Secretary of Homeland Security for the Trump administration. He said that, and during his confirmation hearing in 2017, he said that border security cannot be attempted as an endless series of goal line stands on the 1 foot line at the ports of entry, the football metaphor, right? At the 1 foot line at the ports of entry, or along the thousands of miles of border between this country and Mexico. I believe the defense of the southwest border starts 1,500 miles to the south with Peru. That's an exact quote. And I did check the geography on that. I took the mileage and checked to see if Peru was 1,500 miles, and it's further than 1,500 miles. As always, the geography. Some of our officials are a little geographically challenged, perhaps. But exactly 1,500 miles was the next place I want to talk to you about, which is Zacapa, Guatemala. And that was one of the first places I went once I started really researching Empire of Borders. And Zacapa is, it's located kind of close to the Honduran border. And it has a military base. And I was going to the military base, and I had arranged a meeting with the commander there of what was the new border patrol Guatemala called the Chorti. I miscalculated 100 things. I ended up, getting there like 2 hours late. I forgot I was in Honduras, and I forgot that the buses didn't run at night in Honduras, among a zillion other things. And I got there 2 hours late. And so I had to convince the soldiers at the gate at the military base to still let me interview the commander. And my whole point of going there, the whole thing that I wanted to learn, was if the United States had been involved in creating this border patrol in Guatemala. That was the one thing I wanted to know. I wanted to see if, like, what they would tell me, if I could get any information on what the U.S. involvement was. And so the soldiers go. I'm kind of waiting there at the gate. The soldiers go and start to talk, and then eventually one of the soldiers comes back, and then he asked me if I was with BORTAC, and I went, what? And now BORTAC, I when I was doing presentations on the book, I'd ask people around the entire country. I was like, have you ever heard of BORTAC? Nobody's heard of BORTAC. I mean, some people have heard of BORTAC, but most people, if you just are talking to people, they haven't heard of BORTAC. And the reason why, you have to kind of be like research the Border Patrol a lot to know about BORTAC. And BORTAC, of course, is the SWAT team of the U.S. Border Patrol. And so he asked me if I'm from BORTAC. I went, me? So basically, that was it, proof in the pudding. There it was, the United, 17, 18, 19-year-old soldier knew about BORTAC 1,500 miles away from the United States, at this gate. They had been there, of course. That was proof in the pudding, right? But I still got in there and was able to interview the commander. And the commander, pretty much the first thing the commander said, and everything about this whole thing was very comical, actually, because the commander had just helicoptered in. He'd done a marathon in Guatemala City, and he ran to the rifle range. So when he came to do the interview, he still had the kind of earmuffs on, and he was on a sweaty shirt. And then we started just talking, and he's like, yeah, the Chorti is a creation of the U.S. Embassy. And then he started talking about all the trainings. He talked about how BORTAC was there, Border Patrol, police units, and he talked about their armored vehicles and their guns. All of this were coming from the United States. The armored vehicles, he showed me their armored Jeeps, and I should mention this because I did get an interview with CBP officials in Washington a year or two later, and they talked about those very armored vehicles, and there was an interchange between two of the officials that I thought was quite revealing. And one of the officials called those armored vehicles, which he said they were donating to all the Central American border patrols, right? So not just this one, there was a bunch of others, and they were donations. He called them donations. And the other official, there was three of them. One of the other officials looked at him and said, "Did you just say donations?" And the official said, kind of sheepishly, he said, "Yes." And then, like, he was using a PR term. And another official said, "No, they're not donations. They're an investment." And then he paused and he said, "We expect a return on our investment." And I think that kind of shows like this idea of extending the border, this part of the border strategy in a nutshell. This idea that the extension from the eyes of the United States, they say they're trying to stop people long before they even reach the U.S. border. And so I also was able to like interview trainers that went to international countries and do that sort of thing, and just to see how this whole operation works. And one of the trainers I interviewed, he talked about them being an assessment team. So they would go to different countries, like over 100 countries, and they'll do assessments, like a CBP assessment team. And they'll go look at a border, and they're like a doctor. I think he used that word. They're a doctor, and if the border looked ill, which means if it didn't have enough militarization, I guess, then they would do an assessment and do a prescription. So, for example, in Dominican Republic, the CBP sent an assessment team there in 2006. The assessment team said there was a lot of porosity. It was porous. They needed a border patrol. In 2007, Dominican Republic then, by presidential decree, said we will now have a border patrol. And lo and behold, 2008, they had their border patrol. And I actually, in 2012, I went there after Puerto Rico, and I saw their border patrol. And the border patrol had been trained by the United States, the whole thing, the resources, everything. And they were actually, one of the things that really surprised me, I went to Dajabon. Dajabon's right on the border with Haiti, and it's right on the Massacre River for people who know the geography there. And they had put up protest barricades. It was almost like the wall, a miniature wall, like you see in Nogales, right? And the border guards are sitting on their X's, much like the border patrol agent. Like there would be one border guard, then another a quarter mile away, and it seemed like to be basically a very similar strategy that we see here on the U.S.-Mexico border. And so that's one example, the Dominican Republic. But again, I want to just stress that these are just one of many. Kenya, like it's not just limited to the Western Hemisphere or the Caribbean. Kenya, in 2010, around the same time, Dominican Republic started its border patrol. Kenya started its own border patrol, again with training and resources from the United States. And I went there. I could talk more about that if you want. I went to the Philippines. One of the trainers, that was one of the places he went. What does a 7,000 island nation have to do with borders, right? Everything, right? If you look at, there's documents written about the borders, how important the maritime borders are, how important they are to the global economy, right? How important this whole area is. And so important that the United States gave Philippines $30 million right before I got there, and they built a command and control center in the Manila Bay, which then is kind of like the integrated fixed tower system that we see on the U.S.-Mexico border, with these kind of towers looking over everything, and built by, lo and behold, not a company from the Philippines, but the Raytheon Corporation. So there's that. And then I also went to Jordan, and I want to jump quickly to Jordan, the Jordan-Syrian border and the Jordan-Iraqi border, because their Raytheon Corporation also got a big contract for those borders with money from the United States going through the Jordanian government to the tune of about $300 million a year. And I think the Raytheon contract was $300 million to build, yet again, another surveillance system with kind of integrated fixed towers, command and control centers, armored vehicles, what they call passive fencing. And of course, when you think of Syria and Iraq, you're talking in huge displacements and refugee crises of magnitudes that I can barely even fathom, right? But here's this whole international border system going on in those places, and we can talk about that more. I'm just kind of breezing through some of the stuff. And speaking of companies, one of the things I looked into a lot is the industry, the industry behind this global border apparatus, and it's an industry that's growing. So I went to many different expos and conventions where vendors and corporations will go and sell their wares from all over the world, really. I went to one in Tel Aviv. This one was quite, I don't know the word. You go into the expos, and they're almost like cathedrals of science fiction, or you go into you're seeing a crystal ball to what is being imagined for these Homeland Security scapes or border scapes. And the one in Tel Aviv was all about robots and drones and what they called unmanned ground vehicles. So one of the things that I saw, I went and they were doing demonstrations of some of the technologies. And I remember watching a kind of a ground robot. They had a handgun and a ground robot, and it was like buzzing around the ground. And this announcer who was speaking to us in English, of course, was so there's people from all over the world. Like these technologies were being, developed in Israel, but were being sold all around the world. And while we were looking at this robot on the ground, he pointed up and he said, "Do you hear that?" And we looked up in the sky, and we're like, "No." And he's like, "Yeah, because it doesn't make any sound." And we're like, "What is it?" And we look up, and you see this like white vehicle like flowing back and forth over us, and it's a drone, and he's like silent. He's like, it's silent as a bird. And it turns out it was called an Orbiter 3 drone. And those Orbiter drones could do surveillance, but they were also what they call suicide drones. And so they could get surveillance, but they also served as a missile, so they could dive bomb a target. So that's just one example of many examples of what you see at these expos. This kind of for this industry, and this industry is like when I wrote Border Patrol Nation in 2014, I believe the Homeland Security global industry was about $300 billion. And the latest one I saw was for $800 billion projected for 2025. So and this was a post-COVID projection. So looking at, COVID like is causing like a lot of, is helping the border industries in terms of biometrics, in terms of what they call non-touch technologies, those sorts of things. And the projections for the border industries seem to be, in boom periods, as some forecasts have put it. And then I also went to an expo called the International Summit on Borders, and I want to mention this one too because they not only talked about the kind of technology of enforcement, but they talked about the technology of how people who can pass through borders without problems can do that more easily. And one of the things they talked, so the International Summit on Borders was actually put on by Customs and Border Protection in Washington, D.C., but it was about 40 different countries participated in it. But one of the technologies they talked about there was one they called Happy Flow. So strike your Orwells. Happy Flow was being a pilot program in Aruba. So if you arrive to Aruba, you get off the plane, and you facial recognition takes your face, picture of your face, and if all checks out, and that's the key, if all checks out, you cruise right through, and no agents, nobody questioning you, and they made the joke every time that, and then you'll have your luggage delivered to your hotel room, right? And so this idea that there's a sector that there's completely open borders for, was very much a part of this International Summit on Borders. In fact, they talk quite a bit of this harmonization of borders, what they call harmonization. I heard it over and over and over and over again. Harmonization among all these different countries. Why haven't we figured this out before? Why are we just starting to do this? It's because not only the United States that's extending its borders, it's European Union, it's Australia, it's other places. Why aren't we cooperating? Why aren't we doing this all together? So there's open borders, not only for people like me with US passports, right? Or anyone with a US passport, but also for US corporations, also for the US military, also for political interests. There's open border also for greenhouse gas emissions. There's open border policies seemingly for all of that stuff. And then the closed border policy seems to be the people that are the ones impacted by all of that stuff. And the ones that are displaced or dispossessed often, like there's an open border policy for mining companies, for example. as one example, and the extraction of natural wealth. But the people who might have, whose water supplies might be poisoned and can no longer survive there and have to move, there's a closed border policy for them. And so this harmonization is one of the biggest epiphanies that I had in this book, was that, wow, the border, like the US-Mexico border is one part of a much bigger global apparatus that's forming between the global north and the global south. And then when you do the calculations, it's more than 70 border walls, right, around the world. 70 border walls. 2/3 of those there's 15 border walls in 1989, 2/3, and then 70 now. 2/3 were constructed after 9/11. And so it's been in accelerated fashion, these border walls are going up. But not only border walls, as I just mentioned, hundreds of billions of dollars in technologies, hundreds of millions of agents, armed agents, that are pretty much going between, in ways between the global north and the global south, to use maybe too simplistic of a term, but that's what seems to be happening. And so I wanted to end by saying, and we can go into questions, but I wanted to end by saying also, like, as I've traveled the world doing all this book, and I have stories within Empire of Borders and of the mighty resistance to this stuff, in many different forms, small and big, in many different ways and diverse ways, from like civil disobedience to very spiritual ways. The kind of resistance and engagement with this that I've seen, and I mean this with all the other books, is could like fill up, volumes. I think volumes and volumes, and it seems like it's really imperative to say that, especially as I speak with the Migrant Trail walk, and in this spirit, because in my opinion, as I've seen like so many, I could just sit here and probably name a number of different, like go into a number of different stories that illustrate just that, this kind of solidarity, often cross-border solidarity that happens, the kind of coordination between peoples, the subversion of the border, and just the outright subversion of it in some cases. But one of the things that has inspired me for the last 17 years has been the Migrant Trail walk. I mean, one of the things about it is like the consistency of it. It's year after year after year after year after year it happens, and it doesn't even matter like if anyone pays attention or not. It has to happen. It does. It just happens year after year. And it's this like it's to me it's really beautiful. It's a beautiful resistance, and I'm just like really happy to play even a small part in it. And I often think, like last year I went to the very end of, I was able to go to Kennedy Park, and I actually went to Kennedy Park yesterday in celebration, because I know I can't go there on Sunday. So I went there on yesterday on my bike, just to go reflect on thinking about the trail walk. And I went there to the Kennedy Park last year with my 4-year-old, and met Tom at the end, and I just remember watching the walkers come in, and my 4-year-old couldn't stop talking about the walkers for the next for months. Actually, I brought it up. He stopped talking about the walkers after a couple of months, and then I brought it up a couple of days ago. You remember the walkers? He's like, yeah, I remember the walkers. And so like just that, and the end, and I just remember the times that I didn't even have to do it. I just had to watch the people, everyone walking in, and I could feel I could just feel the strength. I don't know how to put it, but and I just remember like the times that I personally finished and thinking, even though I'm like chafed, I could barely walk. One year my eyes were blood red, burned. I couldn't couldn't even, I regretfully like wore my regular glasses instead of sunglasses and scorched my eyes. And it, like, I remember like those days, arriving to Kennedy Park and thinking, I could go another 75 miles, I have this, I have something inside. And it wasn't just me. It was like feeling this collective energy. And I felt it every single time. And I felt it like last year when I was with William at the end. And it's like this feeling. And I remember watching some of the speakers speak after it. It's like this feeling that, and I think one of the speakers said this, that you could literally walk back at like 75 miles and tear down that border wall with your bare hands. That's the kind of feeling that it feels like. And I think that that it's just one of the, it just contributes, I think, to this broad spectrum of things. And I'll leave it at that for now, but I thank you for listening.
I had to unmute. Thank you, Todd. That was incredible. Wow, you bring such an electric energy always with you. I hope, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? No?
I can.
Oh,
yes,
Todd
we
can.
can. Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. That was amazing. So what's going to happen next is we're going to take a 5-minute break, and Eric and Saulo are going to switch us over into webinar mode. And then we can go to the Q&A and start fielding some questions. So we'll take and again, thank you, Todd. That was amazing. Hopefully you can stick around for the questions.
Yeah.
So we'll come back at 30 minutes after the hour.
Sounds good.
At whatever time 30 it is in your time zone.
So you can have a bio break and come back at 30.
There you go.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna take a break too. I'll be right back.
Sounds good. Let's sit down.
Once you are back to attendee mode, please feel free to start adding questions to the Q&A. So if you click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to start putting in questions that you would like to share or comments that you would like Todd to respond to. I do also have the chat open, so if you'd like to chat, we'll go ahead and close that back when we get into the Q&A mode, but if there are things that you would like to post, please feel free to do so now. We always end up moving one of the panelists over.
Okay. So I'm just, I think you can probably hear me. I'm just now opening up our Q&A here. And Todd, can you see that as well? We've got Todd muted right now.
He muted himself.
Okay. No.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, I thought you did. Okay.
There you go.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So I guess we've, if you, Todd, I guess we forgot to sort of finalize this. I can read from the Q&A and field some of these questions and send them your way. Does that work? Because there's going to be a lot coming in. So I'm going to try to field these and then send them to you. Does that make sense, Todd?
Yeah, just you field them and send whatever ones you want me to address.
Okay. And can you see them all coming in?
I can, but there's so many and they're
okay.
kind of long that it'd probably be best if you
okay. Yep. All right. So bear with me here, everyone, as I sort of sort through this first group. Thank you all for asking so many questions. Wow, I'm sorry. I'm trying to do the work of putting these all together. They're really interesting. I'll just take one from the top here. You have been talking about how we, the United States, have been and are expanding our borders outward. What about internally? I'm thinking, for example, about how ICE has expanded its powers seemingly everywhere.
Yeah, that's definitely happening too. Yeah. I was talking about the expansion because that's what the book was about, was expanding outward. But of course, you could focus on the internal expansion of the U.S. border in many different ways. For as one example, the 100-mile zone, that the border jurisdiction, the 100 miles from the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, 5,000-mile U.S.-Canada border down the coast. All of it is border jurisdiction. 200 million people live there, 2/3 of the U.S. population, and that's just Border Patrol jurisdiction, right? So you have that internalization. When you look at the budgets of if you look at the combined budgets of Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or if you go back to 1994, right, with Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Hold the Line, Operation Safeguard, those first kind of operations of prevention through deterrence, and you look at the budget, and that year it was $1.5 billion, and if you for the annual budget. And if you come to 2019, I believe, it's $24 billion. If you take, so 1994 is the INS budget, which is the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And then 2019 is a combination of Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, $24 billion. So think about that, right? That's what we've seen over the last 25 years has been the most massive expansion, historic expansion of this apparatus that we've ever seen. And that's mainly, like when I'm talking about the international stuff, they can't, there's DHS money that goes into that and CBP money that goes into that, but they can't do foreign assistance. It's against the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 to do foreign assistance with any other department besides Department of Defense or the Department of State. So what they do is they funnel money through the State Department and the Department of Defense to do all these border programs. And so there's all these other budgets there's over 100 programs. So to sift through that, you're going to come up with billions and billions of dollars going into this, that it's additional to that, what those figures I just gave. The figures I just gave is the monumental building of this apparatus in the United States, along its borders, in the 100-mile zones, by ICE, the deportation apparatus, the incarceration regime, the over 250 in immigration detention centers across the United States, right? ICE operations going on everywhere, stuff going along the northern border, increasingly so, in Michigan and New York State and Washington State, so it's like, I was looking at the expansion, but you can definitely focus on the internal part of it as well, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I have a couple different questions here that I'm going to send your way. Oh, no, there were so many. One of these, another question, and I had this one as well, was to ask you a little bit more detail about Puerto Rico, and and also thanking you. We have many people thanking you here for your talk. If you could tell us a little bit more about the purpose of, are they really border patrol trucks in Puerto Rico? And if so, what are they doing there?
So if you look, Border Patrol has sectors, right? Like the Tucson sector, the San Diego sector, the El Paso sector, and Buffalo sector, Detroit sector. So there's one sector that's outside of the mainland, and it's called the Ramey sector, and that's the one that covers the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so there it is. It's a U.S. territory, right? And thus interestingly enough, the U.S. Homeland Security apparatus on Puerto Rico is where the Navy base used to be, in Ramey, the Ramey Navy base, and thus the Ramey sector, in Aguadilla on the West Coast. And so the West Coast should give you an indication for people that know the geography of Puerto Rico. The West Coast is what looks over the Mona Strait. The Mona Strait, across the Mona Strait, is Dominican Republic. And so I went to a wedding right on the West Coast of Puerto Rico just 2 months ago, and there's even more now. I stayed in a place called Aguada, a little town called Aguada, right near Aguadilla, and every day we go out like a block away from where we were staying along the beach, and we'd see a green striped U.S. Border Patrol truck, just like you'd see in Nogales, exactly the same. And now they have the modern ones. When I was there in 2012, they seem to have the relics. Now they have those ones with those white gadgets on top, and all the kind of modern amenities. And so yeah, and not only that, like there's the place I was staying in Puerto Rico, there was a big surveillance tower right next to it. I didn't even realize it. Then I'm like, whoa, there's a surveillance tower looking over the Mona Strait. And so that's part of the border. It's what the U.S. calls the third border. They call it the third border. And so there's heavy enforcement, or especially around Dominican Republic and Haiti. A lot of the rhetoric is around Venezuela, like, oh, what's good if Venezuela could have a free reign? It's amazingly enough, that's the rhetoric, a lot of the rhetoric. It's a lot of drug rhetoric, anti-narcotic drug war sort of rhetoric that goes into it, but they've been putting a lot of resources into policing that border. And so they call it the third border because the first one, U.S.-Mexico border, the second U.S.-Canada, and then the third is the one around Puerto Rico.
Interesting, thank you. I'm just sorting. There are so many excellent questions here. I'm trying to kind of see if I can put them together for you in any way that makes sense. And I'll also keeping time in mind too. Oh, sorry. Well, there was one question I was gonna. I'll come back to some of these. One of the questions was that you seem to, and now I can't find it, that you seem, and I always appreciate how when you give your talks, I get a little window into your journalistic or writing research world and life and experiences. And so, and this question kind of builds on that. And the question asks or comments that in reading Empire of Borders, David here was surprised that you get access to so many conferences and interviews when people might seem to see you as hostile to their agenda. And so we're wondering, he's asking, and I think many of us might be thinking, how do you manage that? And were there times when you were refused or disinvited?
A lot of persistence, knowing unbelievably only probably 10% Google. Yeah, it depends. You know, it's some of the like a lot of the conferences and a lot of them I go to are global as well. So I just sign up for them, and sometimes I have to like talk to somebody and tell them, you know, I'll say I'm a journalist, I'm writing for this publication, I'm looking at this. When I talk about borders, I'll just say I'm looking at borders, I'm interested, you know, talk in the vaguest of terms about, not that I'm going to have this like it's super critical lens on it. And you know, sometimes I talk my way into it, you know, a little bit here and there. But I've had a lot of success, like occasionally not. One time there's a thing called the Border Security Expo, and that's a yearly annual event. It's probably the big Homeland Security industry event in the United States. It happens once a year. There's several others now, but there's one main one that happens in the Southwest once a year, and I go every year. I used to go every year, and then finally one year they caught wind of me, and they refused my credentials, and so then I got in the back and forth of the media person there, and then the media person just just kept refusing me. So I said, okay, you become the story now. I'm going to come anyhow, and I'm going to interview you. And so I did. I went and I interviewed the media person, or I tried to. So I went to it was in Phoenix at that point. So I went to Phoenix. I took Eva Lewis. Eva Lewis happened to be Eva Lewis is the filmmaker who did the film Undeterred. For those who haven't seen it, I strongly recommend that film. And she was with me, and we went to. So I went to ask if I could get media credentials, and the media coordinator came out, and she said no. So Eva started to record, and you can look this up. It's actually on YouTube and we get promptly lectured about journalism, which is kind of funny. So she tells us like how to do journalism, and we're trying to say you're not even letting us in to be able to do the journalism of this Border Security Expo. But then we promptly get kicked out of the Phoenix Convention Center, and then kicked completely off the grounds altogether. It's a kind of comical. It's comical because at the very end there's a duel between Eva and the media coordinator, who has her phone, which is funny. She had her iPhone, and you're at this security expo where they have the most sophisticated technology, all this stuff to spy on people, and all she has is their iPhone, and she's waving her iPhone to Eva. So Eva has it on film, and on the back of her iPhone there's like this inspirational quote, and the inspirational quote was something like, "Don't get angry about little things," or something. So there was that. That was the one time I was rejected, but most of the time I can get into these places and I can get interviews. Sometimes it's hard. And sometimes I have to cast a wide web, meaning that I just send interview requests to as many people as possible and see what lands. A lot of times people don't answer, or you have to be persistent. I'll start with an email, then I'll follow up with phone calls and I'll pester. I will take no for an answer sometimes, you know, that sort of thing. And generally I can get into it, but sometimes not.
Right on. Thank you for sharing. I'm always amazed at your stories and your insight as a journalist, especially. There are so many questions coming in here. I think I want to bring in maybe like one more sort of content related question. And then there are a few questions relating to like looking forward and taking action. And I want to try to bring those forth for you. One of the questions was if you could maybe repeat or tell us a little bit more about how something as horrifying as the COVID pandemic is helping these border industries.
Yeah, so I mean, if you everyone's seen that one of the things that's been done with COVID is the kind of global border lockdown, which, you know, the U.S. border being shut down except for essential travel. But if you look at the CDC order, it's basically totally aimed at undocumented people, particularly asylum seekers, and it's almost like a shock doctrine. It's like a Trumpian shock doctrine in a lot of ways. And I use that word shock doctrine in the sense of to answer this question too, because in this kind of chaos crisis, the whole idea of the shock doctrine is that there's a crisis and your attention is distracted, and then unpopular, policies get put into place, and that often will benefit corporations. And you can look at the border in that sort of way with COVID. And even like it seems to be even more justified. Like, oh, borders are getting closed down. Well, no questions asked, right? Oh, of course that's, even though like the U.S.-Mexico border shut down. I remember as of March 20th, the U.S.-Mexico border shut down. That was the first day that the CDC order happened. On the same day that this plane landed from the Costa Luminosa cruise ship that came from Marseille, France, completely packed with people who were infected with coronavirus. Like people should read about this plane ride from France to the United States, 9.5 hours of people going into respiratory distress, people coughing, like fevers, and this one nurse trying to like tend to everybody on it. And it was so bad that they landed and they made them sit in the tarmac for 5 hours in this enclosed airplane. And then basically they get off the airplane and they're asked by, the sickest people are taken away, but everyone else most of them, I followed up just to see how many people got sick, got coronavirus, and every single person I followed up with eventually got it, probably because of this plane trip or probably maybe because of the cruise ship. But then they all they went into the Atlanta airport. They went into those long CBP lines. Remember, CBP had those long lines right in that time, and who knows how many people they came in contact with there. And then they got on airplanes, and flew all over the place on the same day that they closed down pretty much the U.S.-Mexico border to pretty much asylum seekers, and started their rapid expulsions, right? So and then creating so people get put into like crowded shelters or refugee camps or hotel rooms or whatever, in places in situations that are conducive to the spreading of the virus. So you have this whole you look at it and you see this this whole thing is probably how when you watch the deportations too, how it's spreading the virus. And it seems like you have this like whatever's happening with at least the U.S. version of it seems to be spreading it, but it's at the same time justified. And then the border industry comes in, right? Oh, there's more justification to stop the border, to stop people from crossing, to have more data. There's lots of health stuff going on. Oh, we have to have health data. We have to have this data, biometrics. There's a lot of health kind of surveillance technology happening. There's that, I don't know if people caught the drone that they were gonna that like would sense people coughing or even sense people's temperatures, that they were going to put in over Connecticut, in a county in Connecticut, I think. And those sorts of technologies start to get developed. And for whatever reason, if you start looking at the forecasts and the COVID-19 implications on the border industry, as the rest of the world's economies are contracting, right, and everyone's in economic distress, and that's, you're hearing about unemployment and job losses, you have this border industry that has promising prospects into the future.
Mm-hmm. That's horrifyingly fascinating. One of the questions here, Todd, this is kind of switching gears a bit, but absolutely connected to what we're doing here tonight. This goes back to your history with the Migrant Trail in particular. And the question asks if you could tell the story of how the first Migrant Trail walk came about. And the question says it's you, Richard, and others.
Well, I would say, Richard Boren. I think I see his name somewhere on this. I think it was, so we're talking, it was 2004, right? And at this point, there's everyone in Tucson's talking about, there's all these, every year after year, there's starting to hear about people, finding bodies in the desert and people in the desert. And they talk about, like different, 2004 is the year that No More Deaths formed. Samaritans was getting started. Humane Borders had started. There's all the traditional groups that were doing different things. I remember talking to, Richard Boren was talking a lot about like a march that he did in Texas, and that what if we could apply, I believe, if I remember correctly, and Richard can correct me, but it was a march around a nuclear site in Texas, I believe, and it was for environmental reasons, to stop this a nuclear site from happening, and it was a successful march. And he kept, I remember Richard kept saying maybe we could do something like this on the border, because what is happening with people dying is just unconscionable. And so I remember just like every time I got together with Richard, which at that point was quite often, that seemed to be like we'd end up talking about that, and eventually he upped the ante, I believe, and he said, let's just do it. And it was just me and him, and then we invited another person, Holly Hilburn, and at the time I was working at Borderlinks, and so was Holly. And so the three of us got together and at the Epic Cafe, for people who are familiar with the Epic Cafe in Tucson. And I remember we talked about it, and we just said, at the end of it, we just said, can we commit to do the Migrant Trail, this walk? Can we commit to do this walk and do it no matter what? And I remember we went through this, like, what if everyone ignores us and doesn't do it, or nobody, there's no interest in it, or will we still do it? And we were like, yes, we're going to commit to doing this no matter what. And it doesn't matter to us who joins, who doesn't. I mean, we want people, of course, we wanted people to join in, but it didn't, that was the commitment, that we were going to do it no matter what. And at that, so we came up with a plan, and I believe Kat came in very soon thereafter. Kat, who I believe is the long spirit of the Migrant Trail walk. I mean, Kat and definitely like Margot and Lupe and many others too from that first year, right, from 2004. But I think Kat came in, maybe I think Richard went to a Derechos Humanos meeting and brought it up, and then Kat will have to correct me, but I think Kat came on board at that point, and then we started having organization meetings. Just I think at Time Market, or I can't remember where it was. I remember they were kind of chaotic, but we're all in, and it was the first year, so we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, going to figure out the route was we didn't know what the hell was going on. And, but it was we had to go to the desert and go to the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge, and really for everyone who's done the trail walk, that first year, I believe we still do the same exact route, the same exact campsites. There might be just a little variation, but I think it's basically the same as that very first year. The first year we went to Mexico, though. We went to Altar, and spent, I think that was the only year that we went to Altar. And then we
all
went
the same campsites, Kat says.
all the same campsites. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's amazing to me, so in a way, like I do it now, or last time I did it, I'm amazed at how much it is like the first time in that way. Right. And at the same time, how different it is, and how it's been, developed, and it's more, there's like the first year there was more like what happens, just so the first year also I think there was about 30 of us, including a big contingent from Colorado College, and we're much more rudimentary. I remember the tarps blowing in the wind, and that year I believe it reached 110 degrees, or it was 110 degrees on several days in a row. I remember I believe Hell Camp was deemed got the name in that year as well. I remember sitting by the latrine in Hell Camp, like amid the broken glass, and with this tarp that was blowing in the wind, and trying to be in the shade of it while the sun just beat down upon us. Those are some of my memories from the first year. And we did it, right? We were able to do it, and one of the most beautiful things about doing it is that, we're sitting here 17 years later. I mean, one of the most tragic things, right? Also, because you think in 2004, and with all the stuff happening, and the trail walk was one thing of many things happening, that there's no way that these policies can continue to happen to create this death, right? And so one of the tragedies too is that we're sitting here 17 years later having to still do a virtual Migrant Trail walk during a pandemic, right? And that these policies are the same exact policies, and the policies that we can predict beforehand, because they still exist, the prevention of the returns, that people are going to go through the desert and die. And it happens year after year, and it's predictable that healthy people are going to do this and then die. And so it's like the tragedy of it is that we're sitting here as well.
I think that really transitions also to the final question I was going to ask you, that others are posing here, right? Is how do we find hope and imagine new worlds when also facing this historical reality of these tragedies that continue to repeat themselves? And I mean, part of the question that I'll give to you is, as you say at the end of Empire of Borders, right? You talk about imagining a new world. So how are the ways that you imagine this new world, or how have you seen it imagined? In terms of how might you point us, if I can be so bold, into to go, continuing our work and trying to look forward?
Yeah. I think there's many ways, like, I don't, like, in a way I can't, like, what do I know, right? But what I know, another thing, what I know is that it's like right now, if you look at like the border budgets, they're just on automatic, right? It's just every year after year after year, they get more and more and more and more with the same not even the same policies, the policies get worse. And it just seems like it's on this automatic, right? Like every year, like this, like we can predict the people dying, we can predict the border immigration enforcement budgets are going to be more next year than they were last year, because that's been the case every single year. They never get less. They're always more. And one of the things is that I mean, it seems like it's long past time to like have a really honest like bring in a bit. I mean, in my ideal world, you bring in like a huge conversation about this among many different people from all sides of every border, right? And you begin to look at things in terms of well-being for humanity, right? Instead of and right now it's just like a kind of an imposition. There's not like conversations happening. There are conversations happening, but it's not in the policy realm. Like, for example, if you just want to put it in a budgetary term, like if you look at the budgets, if you look at the federal budgets and you just watch how they increase, then why like and then you think of security, right? And Homeland Security and border security, which I think is a completely malign term. It's a term that's completely inaccurate, but that's used, right? It's kind of used mindlessly. Like we automatically think it's a protectorate, and this idea of security. Yet, like you put all this money into a border wall, or there's all these technologies, or more border patrol agents, but like, to use one example of many, like people are drinking leaded water in Flint, Michigan. Is that not a security issue? Or like how many people are losing their homes to foreclosures during the recession? Or right now, how many people have lost their health insurance during a pandemic? Or how come hospitals don't have protective gear? Or how come we don't have like the basics to be able to even, take care of this kind of global pandemic and address it, and you're putting billions and billions, like I said, 25 billion into. So if you had like people come to the table and just really start looking at things, just even like looked at a pie chart of what money is being spent on, and you had a better like understanding of what the word security is. If you have the word security right now, like border security, well, it's not securing, it creates insecurity for people crossing, right? That's prevention to deterrence. It makes things as dangerous as possible. So that's not for them. That's not security. It creates insecurity for people who live in the border, like the Tohono Nation, like Nellie, I'm sure talked about that yesterday. The whole, like, you can't leave the nation without going through the checkpoints, or off the nation, Arivaca, different places. People live in borderlands, they're not secure. So who's security for? It seems like the security is for a sort of elite, the elites, right? And so what is security? Wouldn't security be the well-being of humankind? Like if we switch the definitions of security to well-being, like then how would the budgets go? Would CBP suddenly be getting less? Would ICE be getting less? Yes, wouldn't it? Would other things that like clean water, like education, like healthcare, like all these other being able to address a global pandemic, right? Being able to address global climate change, the 21st century, the existential crisis of the 21st century, that scientists are saying if we don't get our shit together now, it's going to it's going to totally screw our children and grandchildren. Why can't we be, why can't that be the security issue? And if that's a security issue, then we got to get rid of these borders in the political border sense, right? In the sense that they're imposed, where people are now coming together and organizing together across, from different countries, because that's what these sorts of global issues, are a call for. And so those are some of the initial thoughts I have when thinking about, the future, what can be done. But they're just like some. I think one of the big things I want to say is like, who am I, right? Like, I think what's bigger is like the conversations between wide array of people, like lots of different viewpoints coming in, people most impacted by things, like all kinds of viewpoints, and having, ideas bubble up from there. That would be like a really ideal situation for me, or an ideal situation if I were to think of one.
Mm-hmm. I think, thank you for that. I think you really reminded us and highlighted, and you do this in your work, that for whom do these borders serve versus who is impacted by these policies, right? Like again, this notion of security for whom and for what, and threat. Like, what is the threat? What is this notion of security? I think it's really important that you draw our attention in that direction, certainly, and to kind of unravel that discourse, certainly. Well, I don't want to keep you or I know we could also do this forever. At least I could have this conversation with you for a very long time, Todd. We want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight, because your talk, in fact, it connects so well with Kat's introduction for the week, and Lupe's talk, and then Nellie Jo's, like all. I'm hoping for our experienced and new walkers alike that there's, we're all seeing these connections and the overlap, and also getting to see the faces of people that are taking action and listening to others taking action. And I think it gives us hope, if nothing else, in the face of all of this darkness.
Thanks, Jamie. It's really an honor for me to be able to participate in this. I'm hoping to participate more for the rest of the week, and I've been doing the reflections in the morning and stuff like that. So, and at least watching the video, the video, and it's really, I'm really happy to be able to participate. So thank you.
Thank you, and also just to our listeners out there, I'm taking on this like DJ host role because I can't see you. I want to say that we as the committee, I have this Q&A. I have many of the questions that we weren't able to answer, and I will say towards the end of the week we will be talking on our final day about looking forward and action steps that we can all take in our communities and as a group, because I know that's coming, it's bubbling to the surface for many of us in terms of what can we do where. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there to everyone. And lastly, just a quick reminder to, of course, refer back to your emails, to your daily email and the reflection. Again, thank you, Todd, so much for tonight's talk, and remind everyone that tomorrow we'll be welcoming Dan Millis from the Sierra Club, and we're looking a little bit more closely at the environmental implications of border militarization. So all of these talks, again, are really coming together. Okay, and I think I can thank you, Todd. I think I can hand it over to Eric and Saulo.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Todd. Thank you, Jamie, for leading us through this. And thank you for everybody coming in and being a part of it tonight. Want to also especially thank Roberto, our interpreter, who has been here all week and will be here all week. He probably has the hardest job of all of us. So thank you for doing that amazing work and providing that interpretation and translation. We are posting these webinars actually on the YouTube page, the website, the YouTube page. So if you did miss anything, or if you want to go back and listen to it, please feel free to do that. You'll be finding them over there. I think that's it. Is there anything else that we're forgetting? Probably.
Probably. I think that was the process.
Todd, thanks so much. Appreciate you being here tonight and sharing your insights. And buy the book.
By the book.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Roberto. Lo siento si hablé así muy rápido.